Can you see something wrong in this photo? This is Howard LaCorde. He's from Fort McKay First Nation. It's in the boreal forests in the subarctic in Canada, in the province of Alberta, just north of the city of Fort McMurray. This is the same view, but with the topographic layer. And you can see that there are oil sands developments all around the star of Fort McKay. This is zoomed in a little closer. So you can see this is the First Nation that is literally surrounded by oil sands developments. Oil sands developments are a mining process, so they're open pit mines. And so they also have what they call tailings ponds, which are more like lakes. And the oil sands is really bitumen embedded in sand deposits. And so what happens is fresh water from the Athabasca River is used to wash the bitumen away from the sand, and this is what's left over. This is a close-up of a tailings pond as well. This is part of a mine, an open pit mine. Now, these sorts of photos are what the oil sands proponents, people who promote oil sands industry in Canada, they call this oil sands porn. Implying that all mines look this way, right? And that we're just exaggerating by showing photos. This is an upgrader. So the process of extracting the bitumen from the sand is quite complex. And so there are these huge industrial developments as well, which pollute the air. So not just the water is being polluted, but also the air and dust as particles are blowing around. So this is what it looks like before. This is what we call muskeg that comes from a Cree word, but you may know it as a fen or bog. They're major filters for water. And this is what it looks like close up. So in those muskegs are food sources, wild food sources. A lot of people who live in southern Canada think of this as a useless wasteland. So why not dig it up? No one lives up there in the boreal forest. There's nothing there, but there's food. So you might ask, how is it that Howard LaCorde can live in this area and just have the area mined? How can his traditional territory be mined away? Shouldn't there be some sort of agreements or something, some sort of rights? And in fact, there are. The Canadian government in 1899 signed Treaty 8 in this region. So it's an agreement with First Nations and the federal government that guarantees First Nations the right to harvest off their traditional territories. Recently, in 2005, the Mikisew Cree successfully won a Supreme Court case against the federal government. The Mikisew Cree live in the oil sands region, and they argued that some of their traditional lands had been disturbed without being adequately consulted. And then in 2007, the United Nations had a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. I'll read this to you, no need to read it yourselves. But the part that's relevant to this talk is that it promotes the full and effective participation in all matters that concern Indigenous peoples and their right to remain distinct and to pursue their own visions of economic and social development. So fantastic, we've got a treaty, we have a court case, and now we have a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Perfect. Also, as a part of the United Nations Declaration is the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. So this claims that Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible, with the option of return. So First Nations shouldn't be able to be removed from their territories without their consent, their informed consent. Except Canada ratified the United Nations Declaration, except they claim, and this is on the Government of Canada website, that free, prior, informed consent could be interpreted as providing a veto to Aboriginal groups, and in that regard cannot be reconciled with Canadian law as it exists. So what this has become is that due to the court cases, due to treaty, Canada does require that companies, before developing in First Nations territories, consult the First Nations. First Nations do not have veto power, however. And so consultation takes the form of traditional land use assessments. First Nations are asked to assess the potential damage that a project will have on their ability to harvest food from their lands. So the companies claim that in their environmental impact assessments, when they do a traditional land use component, they always come up with the conclusion they will have no significant impact. First of all, they claim that they might impact a small area, but within a much larger First Nations traditional territory. So that, we might be harvesting an area, or they might be mining an area that has berries here, or moose habitat there, or fishing areas here. But there are moose habitat, berry habitats, fish habitats in other areas, so they are having no significant impact. They also claim, and this is the most common solution, is that they will reclaim the area, so that they will make it so that the area is usable again to First Nations. This is a really common misconception in the Canadian public that muskeg can be reclaimed. There is no example or situation of this ever happening. So the closest that has happened are sort of rolling parkland hills, which are not typical in the subarctic boreal forests. Also, there's an underlying assimilation myth for the companies and the government. Through a series of programs and policies that the Canadian government has had in the past and continues to have, they believe that most First Nations people are not harvesting off their land, not pursuing their traditional ways. And so, they just think, well, no one's using this area anymore, so there's no significant impact. People aren't really on the land. But this is Jameis Grandjam from Fort Mackay. And I was asked about 3 years ago in the winter time to go to his house because he had a meeting with an oil company, Total, who was mining his family's traditional territory. Now, the mining was going to go ahead, but the company was asking James to sign an agreement so he got some financial compensation for mining his land. But my argument is that this is an incredible significant impact because his entire family was being removed from their territory. Once their territory was mined, his grandchildren no longer had a place to go to pick berries or hunt moose unless other community members took them out to their territories. So the argument of reclamation is also flawed because once an area is disturbed, people believe that it has lost its soul. It is contaminated. People live in systems of reciprocity and respect with the food sources. And so you harvest, animals reincarnate themselves as you harvest them. You show them respect through butchering practices, through offerings. And so if you're not showing the landscape and the food respect, it will no longer offer itself. So if an area is completely mined, even if there are some trees planted, it no longer has its soul. You're now in a system of negative reciprocity. And of course, the assimilation myth is simply untrue. Most non-Aboriginal Canadians have never stepped foot on a reserve. They just assume that people aren't out hunting and trapping. But my friend Cindy here is a great example. She's from Big Stone Cree Nation, and she took this photo this winter. She's 23 and pregnant here and hunting moose. In fact, hunting moose is a large, strong part of her cultural identity. In order to be Cree, she needs to hunt and harvest from the land. So this brings me to my research. I ended up doing traditional land use work for First Nations for about 7 years and got increasingly frustrated with the realization that traditional land use assessments were being used as a way to ensure that the projects would go ahead. They were not true, meaningful consultation. And so a lot of the community members, a lot of the elders were telling me that the land was now contaminated, that the food was contaminated. And I felt like I could only hear that so long before I had to respond, that people can't repeat something to you over and over and you can't not do anything about it. So for me, my research is a form of reciprocity. Traditional land use studies, in a way, extract knowledge from elders, put them in a report. That report goes away and it's never seen again. It's never really responded to. And so I just felt like I'd been in as a part of this extraction process. And so for me, doing research on people's perspectives of wild food contamination as a way of giving back. So we have 2 projects, one in Fort McKay where we record traditional knowledge and monitor berry patches, and then also test the berries, monitor the air quality, and another larger project with Big Stone Cree Nation where the community's own environmental monitors are, as we speak, as I speak, collecting food samples for testing, but also, again, looking at the traditional knowledge indicators for why people are concerned about food being contaminated. And again, I would argue that that food contamination extends to spiritual processes. In fact, when the land is unhealthy, people are unhealthy, and the communities become unhealthy. An Anishinaabe scholar, Leanne Simpson, claims that the land is humiliated, and since Indigenous peoples and our knowledge is part of the land, we all suffer. So this brings us back to Howard LaCorde here. For me, what's wrong with this photo is that he's holding bottled water, water that's probably not even safe to drink in its own way. I'm not sure of the brand, but in Alberta, Dasani is a really common brand, and that's Coca-Cola, and they actually take that from the public water supplies in southern Alberta, from the tap water. And so here he is drinking water that he's had to pay for, and he's looking out at his ancestral lands at a river where they used to trust the fish, trust the beaver, trust the animals, and trust the water, and they go nowhere near it now because of the oil sands mining. So my talk is a call to the Canadian government to, first of all, honor the treaties that they signed, in particular Treaty 8 that was signed in 1899, to also honor the free, prior, informed consent component of the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Protocol, and also to have an inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, because as the lack of health with the environment occurs, the lack of health in the community also occurs. Thank you.